You're too old to understand the cloud, the new manager said. He revoked my admin access. I sat back and watched. He accidentally deleted the production database. When he turned to me panicked, I pointed to the door. I can't help. I don't understand the cloud. Sup Reddit. So my new manager called me a dinosaur who couldn't understand modern technology. Stripped my admin access. Told me to stay in my lane. Then he nuked the entire production database and came running to me for help. I gave him exactly what he asked for. Nothing. I, 52 male, spent 19 years as the senior systems administrator at Whitmore Financial Services in Columbus, Ohio. Not a glamorous job. Not something that gets you noticed at corporate retreats or company newsletters. But when the servers stayed up, when the backups ran clean, when security patches deployed without breaking everything, when disaster recovery actually worked, that was me. Invisible work. The kind people only notice when it stops happening. Started there in 2005 when the company ran everything on physical servers in a basement that smelled like burnt coffee and anxiety. The server room was basically a converted storage closet with industrial fans duct taped to the ceiling because the building's HVAC couldn't handle the heat load. I spent my first 3 months just getting that room to stop triggering fire alarms every time we spun up a new machine. Watched the whole industry transform over those 19 years. Helped migrate us from physical servers to virtualization back when VMware was still convincing people it was actually useful. Built our first hybrid cloud infrastructure when AWS was still mostly used by startups who couldn't afford their own hardware. Designed the backup systems that saved us during the ransomware attempt in 2019. 3 days of recovery work that kept the company from losing 8 years of client data. Wrote documentation that trained 3 generations of junior admin. Mentored maybe 15 people through the years who went on to run IT departments at other companies. Got Christmas cards from some of them still. Not because I was particularly warm or friendly, I'm not, but because I taught them things they couldn't learn from certifications or YouTube tutorials. 19 years of institutional knowledge. 19 years of knowing which systems were held together with digital duct tape, which vendor contacts would actually answer the phone at 3 a.m., which legacy configurations looked terrible but actually worked better than the modern alternatives. 19 years of keeping the lights on while everyone else got the credit. Then came Monday morning, February 12th. Conference room A mandatory IT department meeting at 9 a.m. sharp. Our CTO, Barbara Whitmore herself, stood at the front looking like she'd rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror. Third generation Whitmore running the family company. Decent boss overall, stayed out of technical decisions, trusted her people, only micromanaged when something caught fire. I'd worked with her for 12 years and generally respected her judgment. Behind her was a guy I'd never seen before. Mid-30s maybe. Expensive haircut that probably cost more than my car payment. Bluetooth earpiece he definitely didn't need in a conference room. One of those slim-fit suits that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Standing there with his hands clasped behind his back like he was posing for a LinkedIn profile photo. Barbara cleared her throat, said the company was entering a new phase of digital transformation. Said the competitive landscape demanded innovation and agility. Said we needed fresh leadership to drive that transformation forward. Said she was proud to introduce our new director of IT infrastructure, Brandon Kessler. Brandon Kessler. The name alone sounded like it came with a trust fund and a sailboat. She mentioned his credentials like she was reading from a brochure. MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. 5 years at some cloud consulting firm in Chicago that I'd never heard of. Certified in 7 different cloud platforms. AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and 4 others I'd probably never use. Speaker at 3 industry conferences last year. Author of a white paper on digital transformation best practices. What she didn't mention was any actual hands-on experience running production systems, any real-world disaster recovery, any understanding of what happens when theory meets reality at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning when everything's on fire and the executives are calling every 5 minutes asking when it'll be fixed. Brandon stepped forward. Perfect posture, confident smile, thanked Barbara for the opportunity, said he was excited to modernize our infrastructure and bring us into the 21st century. 21st century. Like we'd been running punch cards and carrier pigeons this whole time. Like I hadn't personally designed cloud migrations that handled millions of transactions per day. He talked for 20 minutes. Buzzwords stacked on buzzwords like a consulting firm had vomited on his PowerPoint. Digital transformation, cloud-native architecture, agile deployment pipelines, containerized microservices, zero-trust security frameworks, serverless computing paradigms, DevOps culture integration. Every sentence sounded like it was pulled directly from a vendor white paper. Every concept explained at exactly the level of depth you'd get from reading the first paragraph of a Wikipedia article. Not once did he mention the actual systems we ran, the specific challenges we faced, the compliance requirements that constrained our options, the real-world constraints that shaped our infrastructure decisions over nearly 2 decades. Meeting ended. People clapped. That automatic corporate applause that means nothing except we're all still employed and not willing to make waves. I stayed seated while everyone filtered out. Drew, one of my junior admins who'd been with me for 6 years, caught my eye on his way past, gave me a look that said, "What just happened?" I shrugged. Same thing that always happens. Someone decides experience doesn't matter, and credentials do. Janet, my other senior admin, lingered by the door. Mouthed, "Coffee later?" I nodded. Within an hour, Brandon scheduled individual meetings with everyone on the IT team. Mine was at 2 p.m. Apparently, seniority meant I got to wait the longest to hear how my life was about to change. I spent the morning doing what I always did, monitoring systems, reviewing logs, handling the 3 separate tickets that had come in overnight, a password reset for someone in accounting who'd locked themselves out again, a network connectivity issue in the satellite office that turned out to be a loose Ethernet cable, and a question about backup retention policies from the compliance team. Normal stuff, invisible stuff, the kind of work that keeps a company running, but never makes it into anyone's performance review as an accomplishment. I showed up at Brandon's office at 1:58. His office used to be the storage closet we'd converted into a server room before we moved everything to the data center across town. I'd helped run the cables through those walls back in 2008. Now those same walls were painted some shade of gray that probably had a fancy name like Executive Granite and decorated with motivational posters. One poster said, "Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower." Another said, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." He'd already set up 3 monitors arranged in a semicircle like he was running NASA mission control. Standing desk that probably cost more than a used car. One of those ergonomic keyboards that looks like it was designed by someone who'd never actually typed before. He gestured for me to sit in the single chair positioned in front of his desk. Didn't stand up to shake my hand. Didn't offer me water or coffee. Just pointed at the chair like I was a subordinate being called in for a performance discussion, which I guess I was. Just didn't realize it yet. First thing he said was that he'd been reviewing everyone's personnel files. Said I had an impressive tenure with the company. Said 19 years showed real commitment and dedication. Said my experience was valuable. Then the pause. That specific pause people use right before they say something insulting while pretending they're being helpful. He said the industry had changed significantly since I started. Said cloud infrastructure required a different skill set than traditional systems administration. Said younger professionals tended to adapt faster to new paradigms. Said there was research showing that cognitive flexibility decreased with age, making it harder to adopt new technologies and methodologies. I asked if he'd reviewed my actual work. The cloud migrations I'd led. The AWS certifications I'd earned on my own time and my own dime. The Azure implementations I'd designed. The disaster recovery systems I'd built that had literally saved the company from bankruptcy during the ransomware attack. He smiled. That condescending smile people give when they've already made up their mind and the conversation is just theater. When they're going through the motions of listening without actually hearing anything. Said he appreciated my willingness to learn. Said it was admirable that I'd made the effort to stay current, but said we needed to be realistic about generational differences. Said people my age often struggled with cloud concepts even when they tried to adapt. Said it wasn't a criticism, just an observation about biological reality. Biological reality, like understanding distributed systems, was somehow stored in the same part of the brain that handles reaction time and memory recall. I'm 52, not 92. I've been building cloud infrastructure since before most of his certifications existed. I was deploying containers when Docker was still a startup nobody had heard of. I was implementing zero-trust security frameworks when they were still called "don't trust anything" and considered paranoid. But I didn't say that, just nodded. Let him finish his speech about fresh perspectives and modern approaches and agile methodologies. Waited for him to get to whatever he was actually building toward. Took about 15 minutes of him explaining how the world had changed and how Whitmore Financial needed to change with it, how our competitors were moving faster, how the industry was leaving us behind, how we needed bold leadership to catch up. Then he got to the point. He said he was restructuring the team. Said he'd be taking a more hands-on approach to critical infrastructure. Said my admin access to production systems would be transferred to him effective immediately. I asked him to clarify. Wanted to make sure I understood exactly what he was saying. He clarified. Said he'd be handling all production database administration personally. Said I'd be moving to a support role focused on documentation and legacy system maintenance. Said it was about playing to our respective strengths. My strengths, documentation and legacy systems. 19 years of keeping this company running, and he was pushing me to the corner to write instruction manuals and babysit systems nobody else wanted to touch. I asked if Barbara had approved this restructuring. He said Barbara trusted his judgment on technical matters. That's why she'd hired him. That's why she'd given him the director title and the authority that came with it. I asked if he wanted me to brief him on the production systems before the transition, walk him through the architecture, explain the redundancies and the fail-safes and the specific configurations that kept everything running smoothly. He waved his hand, said he'd reviewed the documentation, said he understood our architecture from the diagrams and the technical specifications, said cloud systems were cloud systems, same principles everywhere, said he'd managed similar environments at his previous company, same principles everywhere. Like our custom-built disaster recovery procedures, were interchangeable with some startups' test environment. Like the specific quirks of our database configuration didn't matter. Like 19 years of institutional knowledge could be replaced by reading a few hundred pages of documentation. I stood up, told him I'd forward the access credentials to IT security for the transition, told him to let me know if he had any questions about the documentation. He seemed surprised I wasn't arguing. Most people in my position would have pushed back, made a scene, demanded to talk to Barbara directly, threatened to quit or file a complaint with HR. But here's the thing. You spend 19 years in IT. You learn to recognize patterns. And Brandon Kessler was a pattern I'd seen before. The overconfident MBA who knew everything about cloud architecture except how it actually worked. The guy who'd never been on call during a critical outage. Never rebuilt a corrupted database at 2 a.m. Never had to explain to executives why the system was down and when it would be back up while they stood over his shoulder, asking the same questions every 5 minutes. Those guys always made the same mistakes. And they always made them fast, usually within the first few months, before they'd learned enough to be dangerous in a more controlled way. I walked back to my desk, started the access transition paperwork, sent the appropriate emails to IT security and HR, documenting the change in responsibilities, CC'd Barbara on everything so there'd be a paper trail. Drew came by around 4 p.m. looking concerned. He'd had his meeting with Brandon already, 30 minutes of being told that his role was being repositioned for the new organizational structure. Asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. Asked about his meeting. He said Brandon had talked about restructuring the whole team. New reporting lines, new responsibilities, new expectations for productivity and innovation. Said Brandon wanted everyone to complete cloud certification programs within 6 months or face performance reviews. Drew had been working in IT for 12 years. He had more certifications than Brandon probably knew existed, but apparently that didn't matter because they weren't the right certifications. I told Drew to document everything, every change Brandon made, every approval he gave, every system he touched. Keep detailed logs with timestamps and screenshots. Drew asked why. I told him documentation is always important, left it at that. He gave me a look like he knew I wasn't telling him everything, but he nodded and went back to his desk. Over the next 3 weeks, Brandon went full speed ahead, like a kid who'd just gotten the keys to a sports car and wanted to see how fast it could go. Brought in 2 consultants from his old firm. Guys in identical expensive suits who talked about our infrastructure like it was personally offensive to them. Every system we ran was outdated. Every configuration was suboptimal. Every procedure was a relic from a less enlightened era. They scheduled what they called an architecture review. 3 full days of meetings where they went through every system we ran and explained why it was wrong. Our database configurations were inefficient. Our backup procedures were wasteful. Our security protocols were overly complex. Our network architecture was antiquated. Brandon sat there nodding along like a proud parent, watching his kids perform in a school play, taking notes on a tablet, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the buzzwords, but not the underlying reality. I sat in the back of those meetings, taking my own notes, not because I needed to remember what they said. Their criticisms were obvious to anyone who'd never actually run production system, but because I wanted a record of what they recommended and who approved it. Janet sat next to me in most of those sessions. She'd been with the company 11 years, started as a junior admin, worked her way up to senior systems administrator, understood our infrastructure almost as well as I did, because she'd helped build half of it. After the second day of architecture review, she caught me in the break room, asked if I was going to say anything. I told her no. She asked why. Said Brandon and his consultants were going to break everything. Said they didn't understand how our systems actually worked. Said they were making recommendations based on theory, without considering our specific requirements. I told her she was right about all of that. She asked again why I wasn't doing anything about it. Because some lessons people have to learn themselves. And Brandon Kessler was about to get an education he couldn't get from any certification program. She didn't look satisfied with that answer, but she didn't push it. Then came the proposal. After 3 days of architecture review, Brandon's consultants presented their recommendations to Barbara and the executive team. Full migration to a new cloud platform, complete replacement of our database systems, elimination of our on-premises backup infrastructure, implementation of a cloud-native disaster recovery solution, consolidation of our security systems into a single unified framework. Total timeline, 6 months. Total budget, $1.2 million. Total disruption to current operation. Significant but manageable with proper change management. I sat in the back of that meeting room taking notes. Barbara was at the head of the table, asking questions that showed she understood the business implications, but not the technical reality. The CFO was next to her, focused entirely on the budget numbers. Brandon sat across from them, confident and polished, selling the vision like he was pitching a startup to venture capitalists. When they asked for questions from the technical team, I raised my hand, asked about the rollback procedures if the migration encountered problems. Brandon answered before his consultants could, said modern cloud platforms had built-in redundancy, said rollback procedures were legacy thinking from an era when infrastructure changes were manual and risky, said we needed to embrace forward momentum instead of planning for failure. I asked about our compliance requirements, the financial regulations that mandated specific data retention and recovery capability, the audit requirements that specified how we needed to document and verify our backup procedures. One of the consultants said they'd address compliance in Phase 3 of the migration, after the core infrastructure changes were complete. Phase 3, after they'd already torn apart everything that currently kept us compliant. I asked about the production database specifically, the one that processed every transaction our company handled, the one that couldn't go down for more than 15 minutes without triggering regulatory reporting requirements, the one that held 18 months of transaction history for 300,000 clients. Brandon said production systems were his top priority, said he'd personally oversee that migration, said I didn't need to worry about it because he understood the importance. I stopped asking questions after that, just wrote down what they said and let them finish their presentation. Barbara approved the project 2 days later. Full budget, full timeline, full authority for Brandon to implement whatever changes he deemed necessary. Brandon sent a company-wide email celebrating the decision, used phrases like bold step forward and transformational change, and innovative leadership positioning us for the next decade of growth. Made it sound like he'd single-handedly saved the company from technological obsolescence. Drew stopped by my desk that evening after most people had left, asked if I was going to fight this. I told him no. He asked why not, said the whole team knew this was going to be a disaster, said Janet had already started updating her resume, said even the junior admins who'd only been here a year could see the problems with Brandon's plan. I told him to trust the process. He gave me that look again, the one that said he knew I wasn't telling him everything. I told him to keep documenting, keep logging every change, keep time-stamping everything. He said he would. The migration started in March. Brandon and his consultants worked weekends, made changes to systems I'd spent years carefully tuning, replaced configurations that worked with configurations that looked better on paper, removed redundancies they considered unnecessary, disabled monitoring alerts they found annoying. Every time something broke, they blamed the legacy systems. Never their changes, never their assumptions, never their lack of understanding about why things were configured the way they were. The test environment started failing within 2 weeks. Database connections timing out, authentication errors cascading through the system, performance issues that nobody could explain. Brandon scheduled emergency meetings, brought in more consultants, spent money like it was free. The issues persisted. I kept doing my job, documentation and legacy maintenance. Exactly what Brandon had assigned me. Answered questions when asked, provided historical context when requested, never volunteered information they hadn't specifically asked for. If they didn't want my expertise, they didn't get my expertise. Simple as that. Drew kept his logs, detailed records of every change, every approval, every decision, timestamps and screenshots and email threads, the kind of documentation that would make any auditor weep with joy. By late April, the problems had spread beyond the test environment. The production systems were starting to show strain. Performance degradation during peak hours, occasional connection drops that lasted just long enough to notice, warning signs that anyone with experience would recognize. Brandon dismissed them all, said it was expected during a transition period, said the new architecture would solve everything once fully implemented, said we just needed to push through the growing pains. Then came May 3rd, a Friday, the day Brandon decided to accelerate the production database migration. I was at my desk reviewing documentation when Drew appeared looking like someone had just told him his car was on fire and his dog was inside, said Brandon was doing the production migration. Today, Right now. Without the testing phase they'd originally planned for. Without the compliance review that was supposed to happen first. Without the rollback procedures that even his own consultants had recommended. I asked if Barbara had approved the accelerated timeline. Drew said Brandon had approved it himself. Said he was the director of IT infrastructure. Said he had the authority to make operational decisions without executive sign-off. Said he'd told the team it was a calculated risk worth taking. I asked what the consultants thought. Drew said they'd expressed concerns. Said they'd recommended waiting another week. Said Brandon had overruled them because he wanted to hit the May deadline he'd promised Barbara. I went back to my documentation, told Drew to make sure his logs were updated, told him to document exactly who approved what and when. He asked if I was going to do something. I told him I was doing exactly what Brandon had asked me to do. Documentation and legacy maintenance. Nothing more. The migration started at 2 p.m. Brandon and his consultants in the server room across town. Video conference call running, so the rest of us could watch remotely. Because Brandon had revoked our production access months ago, we couldn't do anything except observe. For about an hour, things seemed to be going smoothly. Progress bars moving. Status updates appearing. Brandon sending triumphant messages to the team chat about how well everything was proceeding, making comments about how worried everyone had been for nothing. At 3:22 p.m., he posted that they were ahead of schedule, said the migration was proving easier than expected, said this was what happened when you embraced modern methodologies instead of clinging to outdated procedures. At 3:41 p.m., he posted that they were moving to the final phase, said they just needed to clean up some temporary data and the migration would be complete. At 3:47 p.m., everything went red. The alerts started cascading across every monitoring system we had. Database connections dropping, transaction processing failing, error messages multiplying faster than anyone could read them. The entire production environment going from green to yellow to red in about 90 seconds. Drew appeared at my desk, white as a sheet. Said the production database was down. I asked what happened. Said Brandon ran a cleanup script on what he thought was the staging environment, but he was connected to production. The script deleted the entire transaction table, 18 months of financial records, transaction history for 300,000 clients, gone. I asked about the backups. Drew's face got even whiter. Said Brandon had disabled the legacy backup systems 3 weeks ago as part of the migration prep. Said the old backup infrastructure was consuming resources that the new architecture needed. Said the new cloud backup solution wasn't fully configured yet because that was supposed to happen in Phase 3. Said there was a backup from 3 weeks ago, the last one before Brandon had disabled the system, but nothing more recent. 3 weeks of financial transaction for a financial services company. Missing. I asked what Brandon was doing now. Drew said he was in his office with the door closed. Said the consultants had already left the building. Said nobody knew what to do. I went back to my documentation, kept working, waited. Took about 20 minutes. Brandon appeared at my desk, red-faced, sweating through his expensive suit, wrinkled like he'd been wrestling with it. His voice cracked when he spoke. Said he needed my help. I looked up from my screen, took my time responding. Asked what kind of help he needed. Said the production database had encountered an issue. Said he needed someone with deep system knowledge to help recover it. Said this was an emergency. Said the whole company was at risk. I reminded him that I didn't have production access. He'd revoked it in February. Said I couldn't help with systems I couldn't access. Said he could restore my access. Right now. Said he'd already contacted IT security. Said this was urgent. Said people's jobs were at stake. I leaned back in my chair, took my time responding, reminded him of something he'd said in that first meeting, about people my age struggling with cloud concepts, about generational differences in cognitive flexibility, about how cloud systems were beyond my understanding because of biological reality. His face went from red to pale, the confident smile completely gone, just fear and desperation. I told him I couldn't help, told him I didn't understand the cloud. His words, not mine. He started stammering, said he didn't mean those things, said he was just trying to establish his leadership style, said he'd been wrong, said we could talk about it later, but right now he needed my expertise. I pointed toward the door, told him to call his consultants, the ones who'd designed the new architecture, the ones who'd recommended disabling the backup systems, the ones who'd said rollback procedures were legacy thinking, the ones who'd charged $200 an hour to tell us everything we were doing was wrong. He didn't move, just stood there looking at me like I was supposed to save him. Like 19 years of experience should kick in automatically, regardless of how he treated me. I asked if there was anything else. He left without another word. By 5 p.m., the situation had escalated beyond Brandon's control. Barbara had been in client meetings all afternoon, completely unaware that her company's entire transaction history had just been deleted. Her assistant came running into the IT area looking for answers that nobody could give. I directed her to Brandon's office, told her he was the director of IT infrastructure, told her he had authority over production systems, told her he could explain what happened. 15 minutes later, Barbara appeared at my desk, looking exactly like you'd expect a CTO to look when they just learned their entire production database was gone, and their compliance status was about to become a regulatory nightmare. Asked what happened. I gave her the facts. Brandon's production access changes in February, the disabled backup systems in April, the premature migration this afternoon, the deleted transaction table, the 18 months of missing data. She asked if I could recover it. I told her I didn't have production access. Brandon had revoked it in February. She could check the access logs if she wanted verification. She said she was restoring my access immediately. Said she'd make the call to IT security personally. I told her I appreciated that. But the systems Brandon had implemented weren't ones I'd designed or configured. His consultants had built the new architecture. They'd disabled the redundancies I'd put in place. They'd eliminated the fail-safes that would have prevented this exact scenario. She asked what I could do. I told her I could try. But I'd need complete authority over the recovery process. No interference from Brandon. No input from his consultants. Full access to every system and every log and every configuration file. She agreed immediately. Then she asked about Brandon. I told her that was her decision. But I recommended she have someone from legal present when they talked to him, and someone from HR. This was going to get complicated. She nodded and left. I spent the next 14 hours rebuilding what I could. The 3-week-old backup was a starting point, but it was missing 3 weeks of transactions. That meant coordinating with every external system we connected to. Banks, clearinghouses, regulatory bodies, payment processors, client management systems, reconstructing records from their copies of our data, cross-referencing transaction logs, verifying account balances, building back what Brandon had destroyed one piece at a time. Drew stayed the whole night. So did Janet, both of them working through exhaustion because they understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about fixing a technical problem. This was about whether the company survived the next regulatory audit. By Saturday afternoon, we'd recovered about 60% of the missing data. Primary transaction records from external sources, account balances verified against bank statements, critical compliance documentation reconstructed from audit trails. By Sunday evening, closer to 85%. The remaining 15% would take weeks to reconstruct, but the critical systems were back online. The company could function, clients could access their accounts, transactions could process. Monday morning, Barbara called me to her office. She'd been there all weekend too. Looked like she hadn't slept any more than I had. First thing she said was thank you. Said she knew I didn't have to help after how Brandon had treated me. Said she appreciated that I'd put the company first. Second thing was that Brandon had been terminated, effective immediately. His consultants had been dismissed, and their firm was being sent a letter about professional liability and breach of contract. Third thing was a question. Would I accept the director of IT infrastructure position? I told her no. She looked surprised. Asked why not. I explained. I didn't want to be a director. Didn't want the meetings and the politics and the strategic planning sessions. Didn't want to spend my time in conference rooms talking about digital transformation when I could be actually maintaining systems that worked. I wanted to do my job, the job I'd been doing for 19 years. Keeping systems running, building things that worked, protecting the infrastructure that made everything else possible. What I wanted was respect, recognition that experience had value, acknowledgement that understanding systems came from years of actually running them, not from certifications and conference presentations and MBA programs. She asked what would make me stay. I told her 3 things. Senior Principal Systems Architect title, reporting directly to her, not through any director, and final approval authority on any infrastructure changes affecting production systems. She agreed to all 3 without hesitation. Then she asked about Brandon's replacement. If I wasn't going to take the director role, who should? I recommended Janet. 11 years of experience, strong technical skills, actually understood our systems because she'd helped build them, had the respect of the team because she'd earned it through competence, not credentials. Barbara said she'd set up interviews. The weeks that followed were about cleanup and reconstruction, rebuilding systems Brandon had broken, restoring configurations his consultants had changed, implementing proper backup procedures again, the same procedures they'd called legacy thinking and outdated methodology. Janet got the director job. First thing she did was schedule a meeting with the whole IT team to discuss changes and make sure everyone understood what had happened and why. Second thing she did was ask for my input on every major decision. The consultant's firm sent a threatening letter about defamation and breach of contract. Our legal team sent back documentation of every recommendation they'd made, every failure those recommendations caused, every dollar the company had lost as a result. The letter included Drew's logs, timestamps, and screenshots showing exactly who approved what and when. Never heard from them again. Drew got promoted to senior admin. The logs he'd kept became critical evidence for the internal investigation and the regulatory response. Every change Brandon had made, every system he'd broken, documented with the kind of detail that made auditors nod approvingly. By late June, we'd recovered all the missing transaction data. Regulatory audit found no compliance violations thanks to the reconstruction effort. The regulators were impressed by our documentation and our recovery procedures. Barbara sent a company-wide email thanking the IT team for their exceptional performance during a challenging period. Didn't mention Brandon by name. Didn't need to. Everyone knew what had happened and who was responsible. A few weeks later, I got a LinkedIn notification. Brandon Kessler had updated his profile. New position, cloud transformation consultant at some startup in Austin. His summary talked about his experience driving digital innovation at enterprise scale and leading complex infrastructure modernization initiatives. No mention of Whitmore Financial, no mention of deleted production databases, no mention of the $2.8 million the company spent on recovery, regulatory response, and client remediation. Drew showed me the profile during lunch, asked what I thought. I told him to screenshot it. Might be useful someday. 2 weeks later, that screenshot became very useful. Barbara got a call from a contact at a financial services firm in Dallas. Guy named Howard Reeves, their CTO, said they were considering hiring a cloud transformation consultant. Said the consultant had listed impressive credentials and experience. Said the consultant's name was Brandon Kessler. Howard asked if Barbara had any insight into Brandon's work at Whitmore Financial. Barbara transferred the call to me. I spent 45 minutes walking Howard through exactly what happened. The disabled backup systems, the ignored warnings, the premature migration, the deleted production database, the $2.8 million in recovery costs, the 18 months of reconstructed transaction data. Howard thanked me, said he'd been skeptical about some of Brandon's claims, said Brandon had mentioned successful cloud migrations at Whitmore Financial without getting into specifics. I told Howard that Brandon's migration was successful in the same way the Hindenburg's landing was successful. It definitely happened. Howard laughed, said he appreciated the candor, said he'd be going with a different consultant. 2 days later, I got a LinkedIn message from Brandon Kessler himself. First time he'd contacted me since getting fired. The message said I was sabotaging his career, said I was bitter and jealous, said he was considering legal action for defamation, said I should stop spreading lies about what happened at Whitmore Financial, said he'd built a successful track record and I was trying to destroy it out of spite. I forwarded the message to our legal team. They forwarded it to Brandon's lawyer with a copy of Drew's documentation. Every change Brandon had made, every backup system he'd disabled, every warning he'd ignored, timestamped and screenshotted. Never heard from Brandon again. But that wasn't the end of it. 3 months after the incident, I got an email from the Ohio Department of Commerce, Division of Financial Institutions. They were conducting a review of what happened at Whitmore Financial. Standard procedure after a major data incident at a regulated financial services company. The investigator's name was Linda Patterson. She scheduled a 4-hour interview with me at our offices. I walked her through everything. The architecture I'd built, the backup systems Brandon had disabled, the timeline of the migration, the moment when everything went red. She took detailed notes, asked follow-up questions, requested copies of Drew's logs. At the end of the interview, she asked one question that stuck with me. She asked if I could have prevented the incident. I told her yes. If I'd still had production access, I would have stopped the migration the moment Brandon connected to the wrong environment, would have caught the error before he ran the cleanup script, would have saved 18 months of transaction data. She asked why I didn't have production access. I told her Brandon had revoked it in February because I was too old to understand the cloud. She wrote that down, didn't say anything else. 2 months later, the Division of Financial Institutions issued their report. No fines for Whitmore Financial. The recovery effort had been thorough enough to satisfy compliance requirements, but the report included a detailed summary of what had happened and who was responsible. Brandon Kessler was named specifically. His decisions were documented. His mistakes were cataloged. The report became public record. That report followed Brandon to his next 3 job applications. I know because 2 of the hiring managers called Barbara to verify what they'd read. Both times, Barbara transferred the calls to me. Both times, I told them the truth. Brandon's consulting career in financial services was over. Last I heard, he was working at a SaaS startup in Portland. Entry-level position. No production access, no direct reports, no authority over anything that mattered. Probably telling anyone who'd listen that he was a victim of corporate politics and jealous coworkers. Meanwhile, things at Whitmore Financial settled into a new normal. Janet ran the IT department with actual competence. She implemented the changes Brandon had promised but never delivered. Properly this time, with testing phases and rollback procedures and backup verification. Drew got his promotion to senior admin. A recruiter from Seattle had tried to poach him a month earlier with a bigger title and better pay. He turned them down. Said he wanted to stay and learn more. Said there was still work to do. Barbara approved a 15% budget increase for the IT department. Said she'd learned that infrastructure wasn't the place to cut corners. The backup systems I'd originally designed were restored and upgraded. New monitoring alerts, new verification procedures, new disaster recovery testing every quarter. I got my title change, Senior Principal Systems Architect, reporting directly to Barbara. Final approval authority on any infrastructure changes affecting production systems. First time I used that authority was 3 weeks after Janet took over. A vendor pitched a new cloud backup solution. Slick presentation, lots of buzzwords, promised to reduce our backup costs by 40%. I reviewed their documentation, found 3 critical gaps in their recovery procedures. Sent Janet my analysis with a recommendation to decline. She declined. Vendor was disappointed. Systems stayed stable. That's what the job looks like when it's done right. No drama, no emergencies, no 3 a.m. phone calls. Just quiet competence keeping everything running. 6 months after the incident, Barbara called me into her office. Said the board wanted to recognize my contribution to the recovery effort. Said they'd approved a bonus. Handed me a check for $50,000. I looked at the check, looked back at her. She said it was the least they could do. Said the company would have lost everything without the recovery effort. Said $50,000 was nothing compared to what we'd saved. I thanked her. Deposited the check that afternoon. Bought a new truck the following weekend. My old one had 180,000 miles and was held together with hope. The new truck's nice, nothing fancy, just reliable. Kind of like me, I guess. Guys, we are so close to hit 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps hit that 100,000 mark. Thanks for making this dream come true.